2021 is officially the worst year in recent U.S. history for legislative attacks against the LGBTQ community. A record-shattering 24 bills have been signed into law this year so far, including 13 that directly impact the transgender community. With more on this, we want to bring in ACLU attorney Chase Strangio. He joins us now. He's also the Deputy Director for Trans Justice at the LGBTQ and HIV Project. Thank you so much for joining us. Chase, the ACLU has filed several lawsuits against states with anti-LGBTQ legislation in 2021. Most of the legislation that we're seeing is affecting transgender youth in particular, a group already susceptible to high rates of suicide and depression, anxiety. How is the ACLU approaching these cases?
Thank you so much for having me and highlighting this issue. This really is sort of the most brutal and devastating year in terms of legislative attacks on trans people, and as you note, particularly on trans youth. What our approach has been is to fight this every way we can. So obviously showing up in legislatures, trying to stop the bills from passing. Unfortunately, we're in a position now where many did pass, were either signed into law or we had vetoes overridden, and so now we're bringing the fight to court. We have two recently filed lawsuits, one in Arkansas challenging, the first of its kind ban on healthcare for trans young people, one lawsuit in West Virginia challenging their ban on trans students participating in sports. That is our second such lawsuit. We also have an ongoing case from last year where Idaho passed a similar ban on trans students participating in sports, and we have an ongoing piece of litigation that's now on appeal at the Ninth Circuit. So we are bringing this fight everywhere. We know that it is Pride Month. It is a time to really show up for LGBTQ people and particularly for the trans people who are facing these ongoing assaults.
Chase, earlier this week you tweeted that more anti-trans bills became law in 2021 than in the previous 10 years combined. What's your take on why there is such a growing attack, a growing number of legislative attacks on the transgender community?
I mean, I think what we're seeing, is part of really a long history of attacking the entire LGBTQ community. In many ways, this isn't new. This is a continuation of the efforts that we saw in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then the early 2000s to, ban LGBT people from marriage, to stop LGBTQ families from adopting, to ban gay people from the military. There was this moralistic backlash and panic to the notion of the inclusion of LGBT people in public life. And then when you had the Supreme Court in 2015 strike down bans on marriage equality, all of that effort and energy from decades really shifted into attacking the trans community. And that really picked up steam in 2016 when we saw the anti-trans bathroom bills. But that fight in relation to the bathroom was largely unsuccessful. And so what we've seen in the last 2 years in particular is this pivot to really targeting trans young people in sports and healthcare. And 2021 was really a perfect storm where we have the escalation of the backlash, the continuation of the 2020 sessions that were, a lot of which were cut short because of the pandemic. And then this sort of rise in anti-trans discourse within the GOP that I think is very much part of a political strategy for voter turnout in the 2022 midterms, much like what we saw in the early 2000s with the drive to turn out voters through bans on marriage equality at the ballot. So I think that in 2022, what we're going to see, as we've seen in the state legislative sessions in 2021, is a fixation on trans young people and false claims of voter fraud. That characterized the state legislative session. I think we can expect to see that in the next year as well.
And sort of almost on cue, in Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis on the first day of Pride Month signed a bill that banned transgender athletes from participating in school sports in high school and college. And then the next day he vetoed an LGBTQ programs and projects from his state's budget. I just want to get, your response to this and other GOP-led legislatures that are pursuing these sort of bills. But also, people will say, well, these politicians were elected into office, so they represent their constituents. And I just want to kind of give a clearer sense of where the American public stands on these issues. Are they as interested in passing these bills as some of these state legislatures seem to be?
I mean, I think that's a really, I think, important point to highlight. So the bills that we're seeing moving through state legislatures are bills that are, model pieces of legislation drafted by, national groups shipped out to legislatures. This is not a constituent-driven impulse. People aren't in the middle of a pandemic when their kids are likely not able to go to school consistently saying, you know what we need to prioritize is banning trans kids from sports. Because the reality, as we have seen in hearing after hearing in state legislatures, is that no one can even identify any trans athletes, let alone a problem related to them. So this is definitely a solution in search of a problem. It is not something that is coming out of constituents. But I think when we have these conversations in, the public discourse, there is a ton of misinformation. There are these false ideas of trans people dominating sports. And I think something that we have to really ground ourselves in is that false narrative has been percolating for decades. In the 70s and the 60s, you had these conversations about trans athletes dominating in sports. Renee Richards was allowed to participate in the women's U.S. Open in tennis. She lost in the first round. She is a trans woman. The entire conversation then was, well, the domination of trans athletes is just around the corner. We're 50 years past that. There is literally no evidence of trans people dominating in sports. There's a lot of evidence of other issues related to gender equity in sports. What the legislatures are focusing right now is a completely contrived false problem that is a distraction from the issues facing their constituents. And we've seen that time and time again. And unfortunately, because of that misinformation, we're in a position now where 10 states have banned trans kids from participating in sports, a population that already experiences so much discrimination.
So what type of action is the ACLU looking for from the White House?
I mean, I think, so far it has been refreshing to move from a Trump administration to a Biden administration. For 4 years, we had a federal government that was fully on the side of discrimination against LGBTQ people. They took the position at the Supreme Court that it should be legal to fire someone because they're LGBTQ. Thankfully, we were successful in that case. And ultimately, last June, the court ruled that federal laws prohibiting sex discrimination already prohibit discrimination against someone for being LGBTQ. So I think what we need to see from the White House is taking that decision from Bostock from last June and making sure that we have robust enforcement of federal civil rights statutes, that we start to see the federal government weighing in this litigation that we have brought challenging these anti-trans laws. And I expect we will see that just as we did under the Obama administration. So we need, consistent and robust action from the White House. We also need a Congress that is able to do things. Right now, we have at least a Senate that is almost unable to pass anything. We have the Equality Act, which is a piece of federal civil rights legislation that would expand and clarify protections for LGBTQ people and for all communities under existing federal civil rights statutes. That bill has passed through the House. It is not moving anywhere currently in the Senate. So we need to have action, not just from the White House, but also from our representatives in Congress.
And then how can allies of the LGBTQ community help?
I mean, I think this is really important. This is a time to show up. One way to show up is just to educate yourself and educate people in your lives and your community. You do not have to be a lawyer. You do not have to go to court. You do not have to live in a state where one of these bills is pending. We change the conversation. We change the legal norms when people change what is possible in their world, in their communities. So challenge people when they, speak in an anti-trans way. Challenge people's reflexive assumptions about the idea that trans people are a threat to others. And I think that's what we need to see from allies right now, and always show up for trans people in all aspects of your life. Donate to trans-led organizations, particularly in these states that are experiencing these legislative attacks on trans youth, because this is a time when we are going to see the catastrophic consequences of the bills that have passed. Arkansas is imminently going to cut off healthcare for trans young people in that state. We need to show trans kids and their families that we have their back. We need to funnel resources into these places, and we need to change the conversation so that it looks like what happened in the 2000s with marriage equality, where you had people supporting bans on marriage equality who now, 10 years later, would have no recollection of ever being on the wrong side of history as such. And that is exactly what's going to happen here, but it's going to take all of us.
All right, Chase Strangio, really important topic. Great to have you on to talk about it. Thank you so much as always. We appreciate it. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. Thank you.
Also, we want to let you know CBSN is marking Pride Month with 4 weeks of coverage. Topics include everything from the politics of pride to families, education, and health. You can also get our content on demand on the CBS Village page on cbsnews.com.